The rope bit into her wrists, its coarse fibers a familiar cruelty. Dust, fine as ground bone, settled in her hair, on her shoulders, in the cracked hollows of her lips. She did not blink. The sun was a hammer overhead, beating the color from the sky, from the raw lumber of the buildings that lined the single sorry street of redemption. A fitting name, she thought, for a place that offered none. She was tied to a hitching post outside the saloon, the same post where men tied their horses. A fine distinction. The horses were worth something. Her mother's last words had been a whisper, thin as a winter thread. Forgive me. There was nothing to forgive. A body gave out, a lung filled with blood, a farm withered to dust. These were not matters of forgiveness. They were simply the way of things. The selling of her last living possession, a daughter thin as a fence rail, was just the final entry in a long and brutal ledger. The crowd that gathered was not large, but it was dense with a kind of greedy curiosity. Faces she had known her whole life, the blacksmith, the preacher's wife, the grocer, were now distorted by the shimmering heat, their murmurs a low hum like flies on meat. They watched. Some spat tobacco juice into the dirt near her bare feet. Some laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that broke against the oppressive quiet. Most just stared, their eyes holding a dull, bovine judgment. She was a spectacle. A cautionary tale. A thing. She had learned long ago to make herself small, to retreat to a place deep inside where the noise and the stares could not reach. She focused on the grain of the wooden post against her cheek, the rough, splintered lines like a map of a forgotten land. She counted the cracks. 3 long ones, a dozen small fissures branching off. It was a world unto itself, more real than the faces that swam before her. From the shadowed overhang of the general store, a man watched. He was separate from the crowd, a still point in the swirling dust and noise. He carried the land on him. It was in the set of his shoulders, in the deep lines etched around his eyes by sun and sorrow. His coat was a long, gray duster, frayed at the cuffs and stained with the memory of 100 storms. His boots were scuffed and coated in the pale dirt of the high plains. He did not murmur or spit. He simply watched, his gaze steady, his face a mask of weary patience. He had seen this before, in other towns, in other ways. The world had a cruel appetite for the weak. It chewed them up and spit them out, and the crowd always gathered to watch. He carried whole winters in his eyes, the ghosts of losses that had taught him the brittle nature of life. A wife taken by fever. A daughter, small and bright, snatched away by a winter that never seemed to end. He had retreated into his silence then, building a wall of solitude around the empty spaces in his heart. A man named Brant swaggered to the front of the crowd. He was thick in the chest and neck, his face flushed with whiskey and self-importance. He owned the largest claim in the valley and considered everything in it an extension of his will. He circled the girl, his boots kicking up little puffs of dust. He ran a hand down her arm, a gesture of ownership, of appraisal. She flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor that ran through her body like a trapped bird's wing beat. Not much to her, Brant announced, his voice booming with false authority. But she's got a strong back, I reckon. I'll give $20 for the debt. A murmur went through the crowd. It was a pittance, but it was more than anyone else had offered. It was enough to bury a mother and settle a slate. The man in the duster pushed himself off the porch post he had been leaning against. He didn't stride, didn't hurry. He moved with a deliberation that made the air around him seem to still. The crowd parted for him, their chatter dying in their throats. They knew him. Elias Thorne. The man who lived alone out past Whisper Creek, the man who spoke more to his horse than to any person in town. Elias stopped a few feet from Brant. He didn't look at the other man. His eyes were on the girl, on the raw, red lines around her wrists. 50, Elias said. His voice was low, rough, like stones rolling in a dry creek bed. It sounded like it came from under floorboards and used for a long time. Brant turned, a sneer twisting his lips. 50? What's a broken-down recluse like you want with her? Thorne? Need someone to scrub your lonely floors? Elias's gaze didn't waver from the girl. I have my reasons. 70. Brant spat, his ego pricked. 100, Elias said, the words falling into the sudden, heavy silence. It was a significant sum. More than the girl, the debt, and the sorry scrap of land she came from were worth by any rational measure. It was the price of a good horse, of a small herd. It was the price of a statement. Brant's face purpled. He looked from Elias's unreadable expression to the girl's bowed head. He saw an object, a prize to be won. Elias saw something else. He saw the ghost of a small hand that used to fit in his, the echo of a promise he'd made to a dying wife to always be a man of decency. "He's mad," Brant scoffed, but the fight had gone out of him. He wasn't willing to pay that much for pride alone. He shrugged, making a show of his indifference, and stalked back toward the saloon. "She's all yours. Don't come crying to me when she runs off." Elias walked past him as if he weren't there. He reached into his coat, his movements slow, unthreatening. He pulled out a worn leather pouch and counted the coins into the hand of the town elder who had overseen the grim transaction. The man's eyes were wide. Then Elias turned to the girl. He drew a small, sharp pocket knife from his trousers. The blade caught the sun, a sliver of brilliant, painful light. She flinched again, pressing herself against the post, her eyes shutting tight. She braced for the cut, the final violation. But the blade did not touch her skin. She heard a soft snick and then another. The pressure on her wrists vanished. The ropes, severed, fell into the dust. She kept her eyes closed, waiting. But there was no hand grabbing her arm, no rough command. There was only the sound of his boots turning in the dirt and the quiet jingle of his spurs as he walked away. She opened her eyes. He was already halfway to his horse, a stoic silhouette against the glaring sun. He didn't look back. He expected her to follow. For a long moment, she remained by the post, the ghost of the ropes still on her skin. Then, slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up on trembling legs and followed the stranger out of town, leaving the whispers and the stares and the name of redemption behind her. The dust lifted behind them like ghosts. The journey to his ranch was a study in silence. They walked for hours, his horse clopping a steady rhythm beside them, the sun relentless on their backs. The world was vast and empty, a canvas of cracked earth and pale, thirsty sagebrush under a bleached white sky. The wind was a constant companion, a dry, rasping whisper that carried the scent of dust and distance. Elias never spoke. He set a slow, steady pace, never looking back to see if she was keeping up. Yet somehow the pace was never too fast for her aching feet. Once, when the sun was at its most punishing, he stopped. Without a word, he unhooked his canteen and held it out to her. Her fingers trembled as she took it. The water was warm, metallic, but it was the most precious thing she had ever tasted. She drank, then handed it back. Their fingers brushed for a fraction of a second. His skin was rough, calloused like old leather. She pulled her hand back as if burned. He took the canteen, his expression unchanging, and they continued on. As dusk began to bleed purple and blood orange across the horizon, they arrived. The ranch was nestled in a small, defensible valley, cut by a creek that ran even in the dry season. The house was made of dark, weathered timber, solid and unadorned. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress against the world. A barn stood nearby, its paint peeled away by years of wind and sun. A few chickens scattered at their approach. The whole place felt like it was holding its breath. A single grave sat on a small rise overlooking the house, marked by a simple wooden cross. She saw it instantly. It explained the hollow spaces in his eyes, the deep quiet that clung to him like a shroud. He led the horse to the barn, unsaddled it, and rubbed it down with a practiced efficiency. She stood in the yard, a small, lost figure in the growing twilight, wrapping her arms around herself. She didn't know what to do, where to go. She was no longer tied to a post, but a different kind of rope, an invisible one, now stretched between her and this silent, solitary man. He emerged from the barn and walked toward the house. He opened the door and paused, looking back at her. It was not a command, but an invitation. A question asked without words. She hesitated, then took a tentative step and another until she was on the porch. The inside of the house was dark and smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and loneliness. It was starkly furnished. A heavy wooden table and 2 chairs. A stone fireplace, cold and black. A shelf with a few worn books. Everything was clean, obsessively so, as if order was the only defense against chaos. He lit a lantern and the room bloomed with a soft, yellow light that pushed the shadows into the corners. He gestured to one of the chairs at the table, then moved to the hearth. He laid a fire with the same deliberate care he had shown his horse, and soon a small, crackling warmth began to beat back the chill of the evening. He put a pot of water on to boil and sliced thick slabs from a side of bacon. He worked without looking at her, but she felt his awareness of her in the room. It wasn't a threatening presence, just a solid one. The silence wasn't empty, it was filled with the hiss of the bacon, the crackle of the fire, the sound of her own breathing. He served the food on 2 tin plates, fried bacon and hard, dry biscuits. He placed 1 plate in front of her. She stared at it. It was more food than she had seen in a week. Her stomach cramped with a painful, hollow hunger. She picked up a biscuit, her hand shaking so badly she could barely hold it. Elias ate slowly, his gaze fixed on the fire. He didn't watch her, granting her the privacy to wrestle with her own hunger. When he was done, he took his plate to a wash basin in the corner. He did not take hers. He simply left it on the table. When the fire had burned down to glowing embers, he rose. "The room at the top of the stairs," he said, his first full sentence to her since the auction. "It's yours." He gestured to a narrow, steep staircase. Then he took a thick wool blanket from a chest and laid it on the floor near the hearth. He was giving her the only bed. He was choosing the floor. She climbed the stairs, each step a creaking protest. The room was small, tucked under the eaves. It held a simple cot with a thin mattress and a single, clean sheet. A small window looked out toward the lone grave on the hill. The room was cold, but it was clean. It had a door. She went to it, her hand hovering over the latch. She expected it to be lockable only from the outside. But the simple wooden latch was on the inside. She did not lock it. She laid down on the cot, pulling the sheet up to her chin, and listened to the sounds of the house. The wind moaning around the corners. The fire sighing its last breath downstairs. The slow, even breathing of the man sleeping on the floor. For the first time in more years than she could count, she was not afraid of the dark. Days bled into weeks, stitched together with the raw thread of routine. A rhythm established itself, unspoken but absolute. He would rise before the sun, his movements quiet, and be out with the animals before the first light touched the valley. She would wake to the silence of the house, the lingering warmth from the embers in the hearth. At first, she did nothing. She stayed in her room, a ghost in the rafters, watching him from the small window as he mended a fence or drew water from the well. He never called for her, never assigned her a task. He simply left a plate of food on the table for her in the morning and another in the evening. He gave her space, a commodity more precious than gold. One morning, she came downstairs to find the broom leaning by the door. On impulse, she picked it up. The floor was rough-hewn planking, scarred with years of use. She swept, the rhythmic shush-shush of the bristles a strangely comforting sound. She swept the dust and the tracked-in dirt out the door, leaving the floor clean. When Elias came in for his supper that evening, he stopped just inside the doorway. He looked at the floor, then at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He said nothing. But the next morning, a fresh bar of soap sat by the wash basin. It became a language between them, this dialect of silent action. She started tending the small, neglected vegetable patch behind the house, her fingers finding a forgotten familiarity in the soil. She coaxed limp lettuce and stubborn carrots back to life. He, in turn, fixed the broken handle on the well pump, making the chore of drawing water less of a struggle for her thin arms. One afternoon, while weeding, she found a single, defiant wildflower, a spot of brilliant blue in a world of brown and gray. She picked it. Later, as dusk fell, she walked up the small rise to the lone grave. The wooden cross was weathered, the name carved into it almost erased by time. Eleanor. She gently pushed the stem of the wildflower into the hard-packed earth at the base of the cross. A small offering. A whisper of color for a forgotten grief. She was on her way back to the house when he came out onto the porch. He had seen her. She froze, expecting anger, a reprimand for trespassing on his sorrow. But he just stood there, his large frame silhouetted against the lamplight from the doorway. He watched her walk back, and as she drew closer, she saw that the rigid set of his jaw had softened. He held the door open for her. Slowly, the house began to change. It was no longer just his fortress of solitude. A tidiness that was not his own crept in. The books on the shelf were dusted. The single curtain on the kitchen window was washed and rehung. Sometimes, a low, hesitant humming would fill the kitchen as she cooked. A fragile tune taking flight in the quiet rooms. The house began to breathe again. One evening, a storm rolled in, a violent, angry thing that threw rain against the windows like handfuls of gravel. The wind howled, turning mean. Thunder cracked overhead, and the lantern light flickered, casting jumping, monstrous shadows on the walls. She was trying to knead dough for the next day's bread, but her hands trembled with each clap of thunder. A particularly loud crack, directly overhead, made her cry out, a small, strangled sound. She dropped the dough, her hands flying to her ears. The sound was too much like a heavy door slamming shut, like the finality of a lock turning in the dark. Elias was by the fire, sharpening his knife, but he was on his feet in an instant. He didn't rush toward her, didn't touch her. He stood a few feet away, a bulwark against the storm outside and the one inside her. "It's just the sky," he said, his voice a low rumble, steady and calm. "It can't get in." She lowered her hands, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a terror that was older than this storm. "Don't lock me in," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "Please." He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the walls of his own solitude crack. He saw not just a frightened girl, but the shape of her past, the bars of the cage she carried inside her. "I don't lock doors," he said, and the simple declaration was a vow. Not ever. He went back to the fire, but he did not pick up his knife. He just sat, his presence a quiet anchor in the tumultuous night. She returned to her dough, and though her hands still shook, she finished her work. The loaf she baked the next morning was misshapen and dense. When he tried a piece, he chewed for a long moment. "A little dry," he observed, his tone neutral. "You didn't complain about yours," she shot back, the words sharp and surprising even to herself. A ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was a fleeting thing, there and gone, but it changed the landscape of his face completely. "Mine were meant to build fences with. This one just died in vain." She found herself smiling back, a real, if hesitant, smile. It felt like a muscle she hadn't used in years. In the warmth of the kitchen, with the storm past, something small and hopeful had taken root. The peace was a fragile thing, a thin sheet of ice over deep water. They had built a life, a quiet sanctuary walled in by routine and unspoken understanding. But the outside world had a long memory. The harbinger came on a hot, still afternoon. It was not a letter, not a writer. It was a pillar of smoke rising from the direction of the southern ridge, thick and black against the pale blue sky. It was too dark for a brush fire. It was deliberate. Elias saw it from the barn. He stood motionless for a full minute, his hand resting on the handle of a pitchfork. A tension coiled in his shoulders, a sudden sharp alertness that replaced the weary calm she had grown used to. He did not need to say a word. She saw it from the porch, and a cold dread, familiar as her own skin, washed over her. The past had found them. He went into the house, took his rifle from its pegs on the wall, and checked the action. The metallic click was unnervingly loud in the quiet home. He moved with a grim purpose that made her heart pound against her ribs. "Stay inside," he said. It was not a suggestion, but she did not obey. As he walked out to the edge of their small valley, his rifle held loosely at his side, she followed, stopping by the corner of the house. She would not hide. Not this time. They didn't have to wait long. 3 riders appeared on the ridge, stark silhouettes against the smoke they had made. They rode down into the valley slowly, arrogantly, as if they owned it. Leading them was Brant. He looked heavier, his face more florid, but the same sneer of entitlement was firmly in place. They stopped 20 yards from Elias. Brant's eyes swept over the tidy yard, the thriving garden, the girl standing half-hidden by the house. His gaze lingered on her, and it was like a physical violation. She was no longer the starved, ragged thing he had bid on. There was a quiet strength in her stance, a clarity in her eyes that had not been there before. This only seemed to fuel his anger. "Thorn," Brant called out, his voice slick with false cordiality. "I've come to collect my property." Elias didn't raise his voice. He didn't raise his rifle. "She's not property. And she's not yours." "I have a bill of sale," Brant lied, patting a pocket in his coat. "The town council agrees. You interfered in a legal transaction. $100 was a down payment. I'm here to settle the rest and take what's mine. The only thing you'll be settling here is how fast you can ride back out," Elias said, his voice flat and cold as riverstone. "This is my land. She is under my protection." Brant laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the quiet valley. "Your protection? An old man with a rusty gun?" "I brought friends." The 2 men with him shifted in their saddles, their hands resting on the butts of their pistols. The world seemed to shrink, to focus on the small patch of dirt between the men. The wind died down. The land itself was holding breath. Brant's gaze slid back to her. "Come on now, girl. No need for this to get ugly. You come with me and I'll forget the old man ever got involved." She felt a tremor of her old fear, the instinct to shrink, to disappear. She saw the post in the center of town, felt the ghost of the ropes. But then she looked at Elias, standing his ground, alone, weathered bulwark between her and the world. She saw the clean sheets on her bed, the wild flower on the grave, the ghost of his smile over a poorly made loaf of bread. This was not just his land. It was hers. He was not just her protector. He was home. She stepped out from behind the corner of the house, fully into the open. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her feet were steady. Brant's eyes widened in surprise. Elias glanced at her, a quick, sharp movement. His expression was a mask, but she saw the flicker of concern, of warning. Stay back. But she kept walking until she was standing beside him. She was smaller, slighter, but her presence beside him doubled their front. It changed the geometry of the confrontation entirely. It was no longer one man against three. It was a home defending itself. I belong here, she said. Her voice was thin, but it carried in the still air, clear and unwavering. It was the sound of a lock breaking. Brant stared at her, his jaw slack with disbelief. He had come for a possession, an object. He was being defied by a person. The audacity of it enraged him. You don't get a choice, he snarled, swinging down from his horse. He started toward them, his hand going to his hip. I'll drag you out of here myself. Elias finally raised the rifle, the movement smooth and economical. He didn't aim at Brant's chest, but at the ground just in front of his feet. Take one more step. Brant froze. He was a bully accustomed to fear and compliance. He was not accustomed to unyielding resolve. He looked from Elias's cold, steady eyes to the girl standing beside him, her chin lifted in defiance. He saw two people who had nothing left to lose and one thing worth dying for. He saw that he would not leave this valley without a cost, and his own skin was worth more to him than his bruised pride. He hesitated, the bravado leaking out of him like air from a punctured tire. He looked at his men, but they offered no support, their expressions uneasy. This was not the easy work they had signed up for. With a final, venomous curse, Brant spun around and yanked himself back onto his horse. This ain't over, Thorn, he spat. But it was. The threat was broken. He and his men turned and rode away, their retreat hasty and ignoble. They spurred their horses up the ridge and disappeared over the top, leaving only the fading sound of hoofbeats and the lingering pillar of black smoke in the distance. Silence descended on the valley again, but this time it was different. It was not empty. It was vast, open, and clean. Elias slowly lowered the rifle. He did not look at her, but he was intensely aware of her standing beside him, not trembling, not crying, just breathing. The heat of her presence was a palpable thing. He turned and started back toward the house. His shoulders, which had been rigid with tension, seemed to slump with a profound weariness. She followed. Inside, he leaned the rifle back on its pegs. He walked to the wash basin and splashed cold water on his face. His hands braced on the edge of the basin, his head bowed. She stood in the middle of the room, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving a strange, hollow lightness behind. I was scared, she said to his back. He nodded, not turning around. I know. He finally straightened up and faced her. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw a deep, aching vulnerability, and something else. A fierce, quiet pride. You didn't run, he said. It was the highest praise he could offer. That night, they sat by the fire, the flames casting a warm, dancing light on their faces. The silence between them was no longer a space to be cautiously navigated, but a shared comfort, a blanket woven from the threads of all they had endured together. He looked at her, his expression serious. I've been calling you girl in my head. It ain't right. You have a name. It was a question, the most important one he had ever asked her. She swallowed, her throat tight. A name was a claim to self, a thing she had thought long lost. Lena, she said, her voice barely a whisper. He tested the sound of it, rolling it over in his mind. Lena, he repeated, and the way he said it, it sounded like a promise. Like a foundation stone being laid. This is your home, Lena. If you'll have it. Tears she had refused to shed in the face of cruelty and humiliation now welled in her eyes. They were not tears of sorrow, but of a profound, painful, and overwhelming relief. She could only nod, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. A new life began. The next morning, she took the tattered, filthy dress she had arrived in, the one she had kept folded at the bottom of a chest, and she burned it in the fire. She watched the ragged cloth curl, blacken, and turn to ash, and felt the last ghost of the girl tied to the post turn to smoke and vanish up the chimney. Together, they rode out to where Brant's fire had blackened the ridge. They spent 2 days rebuilding the stretch of fence he had destroyed, working side by side under the hot sun. They moved in an easy rhythm, handing tools back and forth, their hands brushing, their movements anticipating each other's. They were not just mending a fence, they were reclaiming their land, their peace. They were stitching their lives together. When they returned to the house, exhausted and covered in soot and sweat, Lena hung a string of dried herbs by the kitchen window. A small touch, but it changed the light. It smelled of time and resilience. The house, which had once felt like a hollow tomb of memory, now felt alive. It breathed with them. The seasons turned. The harsh sun of summer softened into the golden light of autumn. The first frost painted the valley in silver. The quiet companionship between them deepened into a bond that needed no words. He would find a hot meal waiting for him no matter how late he came in from the cold. She would find an extra log on the fire, a mended tool on the porch, a path cleared through the snow. These small, unspoken kindnesses were their love story. One evening, sitting on the porch, watching the snow fall in thick, silent flakes, he turned to her. "You're either the kindest woman I've ever met," he said, his voice low, "or the most foolish for staying." She smiled, a slow, sure thing now. "Can't I be both?" He looked out at the land, at the quiet fall of the snow blanketing the grave on the hill. The winter in his eyes had not vanished, but it no longer held the same killing frost. It was just a season now, one that would eventually give way to spring. "Yes," he said, a soft breath of steam in the cold air. "I suppose you can." He reached over and, for the first time, took her hand. His was large, rough, and warm. Hers was small, but it did not tremble. It fit inside his as if it were made to be there. They sat there for a long time, watching the world turn white, two solitary figures who had found in each other a reason to endure the storm. They had built more than a home. They had built a horizon. This story, it isn't just about a rescue. Fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. It's about the quiet courage it takes to build a life from ruins, to find a home not in a place, but in a person. It's about the profound truth that sometimes the greatest acts of love aren't spoken in grand declarations but are lived out in the silent, steady offering of warmth against the cold. It's a story that reminds us that a name is a holy thing, a reclamation of the soul. When he finally asked her name, he wasn't just asking for a word. He was saying, "I see you. You are not an object. You are a person with a past that matters and a future I want to be a part of." He was giving her back her own reflection. "So here's your naming. You are not your wounds. You are not what was done to you. You are the one who survived it." We all have our own private wilderness, our own silent griefs we carry like stones in our pockets. We build our fences and we learn to sleep with one eye open. But if you are very lucky and if you are very brave, you might find that person who sees the fence not as a wall to keep them out, but as a boundary to be respected, a line they will stand on and defend with you. That right there is the kindest shelter. It's the place where you can finally set the stones down and learn to breathe again.